My western village in my backyard really started out with just false fronts, and it just got bigger and bigger.
Picture the house from every western you've watched. Oak plank saloons, a porch raised in a week by a crew with a full lumberyard nearby. Now, forget it. Most frontier families never touched a plank of lumber for years after they arrived. They built out of the dirt under their boots, walls stacked 2 feet thick, and raised children inside with snakes in the roof and water hauled a mile by hand. But the strangest part of this story isn't what those houses lacked. It's what one particular roof did to one particular family the night before a photographer showed up. Start with what the house was actually made of, because it wasn't wood and it wasn't stone. On the treeless plains of Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, lumber had to come in by rail, and rail-shipped lumber cost more than most homesteading families earned in a month. So they built with the one material the government had just handed them for free: the ground itself. A settler hitched oxen to a breaking plow and cut long ribbons of thick prairie sod, root-bound turf that held together almost like a woven mat, then stacked the strips brick-style into walls 2 or 3 feet thick. A young Swedish immigrant named Rolf Johnson, 20 years old and newly arrived in Phelps County, Nebraska, kept a diary of the whole process. His oxen, he wrote, were unaccustomed to the plow and tried to walk in 40 directions at once. Raising walls in a prairie wind, he added, was nowhere near as pleasant as a buggy ride with a girl. Those walls were the good news. 2 feet of packed earth kept a house cool in July and warm in a February whiteout, cooler than anything built from wood or stone. Step through the doorway of a surviving soddy today and you can still feel it. A damp, mineral coolness that clings to the air, even in August. But the floor underneath your feet was the same dirt as the walls, because a wood floor was another expense most families couldn't touch. Dirt floors meant dust that never fully settled, and mothers learned a trick passed down from neighbor to neighbor. Pour the greasy water left over from washing dishes straight onto the floor. The grease bound the dust into something closer to hard clay. It also drew bugs. Fleas, bedbugs, and centipedes were a permanent part of the household, and more than one family wrote later about waking to find a snake had come down through the sod roof, looking for the same thing the family was hiding from: the heat of the day. Water was its own daily war, and it started before sunrise. There was no well pump in the kitchen, no faucet, nothing indoors at all. Someone, usually a wife or a daughter, walked to the nearest creek or dug well with 2 buckets on a yoke, filled them, and carried the weight back across open prairie, sometimes a mile each direction, twice a day. Every drop used for drinking got boiled first, because nobody trusted a creek that cattle also drank from. And boiling meant burning wood or dried buffalo chips that had to be gathered by hand as well. A full bath, the kind with a tub and hot water, might happen once a week if the family was lucky. And in winter, it happened in whatever room had the stove, in full view of everyone, because that was the only warm room in the house. Food followed the same logic as everything else out there. Whatever the land gave up, plus whatever you'd hauled in before the nearest town, became a 2-day round trip. A root cellar dug into the dirt kept potatoes, turnips, and salted meat from spoiling through winter. And a good garden meant the difference between eating and not. Coffee got stretched with roasted grain when the real thing ran out. Sugar was rationed by the spoonful, and when the crop failed, and on the plains it failed often, a family ate whatever was left in that cellar and nothing else, all the way to the next harvest, because there was no grocery run to fall back on, only the hole in the ground you dug yourself the summer before. And yet the same families who hauled water before dawn also wrote about pride. Some lined their interior walls with newspaper, pasted sheet by sheet as both insulation and decoration, so that a homesteader's front room might carry a wall of French headlines from the old country, or Omaha grain prices from 3 winters back, wallpapering the dirt with whatever they had. One Custer County family refused to let a traveling photographer shoot the outside of their soddy at all. They didn't want their friends back east seeing how they actually lived. But the mother insisted he come inside and photograph one thing: the parlor organ they'd saved 2 years to buy. No plumbing, no floor, no glass in half the windows, and a full-sized musical instrument sitting in the corner, like a small monument to the life they still believed they were building. The nights were their own problem, and it had nothing to do with outlaws. Forget the gunfights, the saloon shootouts, the whole Hollywood catalogue of frontier violence that almost never actually happened to an ordinary homesteading family. Most families lived far enough from any neighbor that a scream wouldn't carry, and the real nighttime sound was wind pushing through the grass, coyotes working a den somewhere close, and a door with a latch that a determined animal or a determined man could probably still force. The isolation itself was its own kind of danger. The quiet, uneventful kind that never gets a name in a movie script, but that pioneer women wrote about constantly, weeks at a time, without seeing another adult face besides their own husbands. Some families kept a rifle leaned by the bed the way you'd keep a phone on the nightstand today. Not because trouble came often, because if it came, the nearest help was a half-day's ride away, and everyone in the house understood exactly what that meant. Sickness carried the same weight as a wolf at the door, and it was far more likely to actually arrive. There was no doctor down the road. The nearest one might be 40 miles off, reachable only by wagon, over trail that turned to mud in a hard rain, which meant a fever that would be a same-day errand today could take a full week just to get looked at. Families treated what they could with whatever the pantry and the prairie offered: willow bark for pain, whiskey for almost everything else, and prayed the rest of the way through. Losing a child to something as ordinary as measles or a bad case of dysentery wasn't a tragedy that made the newspaper out there. It was common enough that most families who stayed on the plains for a decade had buried at least one. That's the house. Now meet the man it eventually broke. George Barnes homesteaded in Custer County, Nebraska in the 1880s on a sod claim like thousands of others scattered across the plains. His wife died of an illness nobody in the family could name, leaving him alone with 3 young children and a quarter section of land that wasn't yet producing enough to feed them. He kept farming anyway, because a homestead claim wasn't legally yours until you'd proven it. 5 years of continuous work, or the whole thing reverted to the government. There was no version of quitting that didn't cost him everything he'd already put in. The grasshoppers didn't help. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, swarms of Rocky Mountain locusts rolled across the plains in numbers nobody at the time had language for. Clouds that blotted out the sun and stripped a field bare in an afternoon. Families burned smudge fires, beat pots and pans, dug trenches, and drowned the swarm by the bushel, and still lost entire seasons of crop to insects that move faster than a man could run. For a widower already farming alone with 3 children, a single failed season wasn't an inconvenience. It was the whole year gone, with nothing in reserve to carry them through the next one. Then, in 1887, it rained. It rained hard, the kind of storm that soaks a sod roof clean through in a single night. Barnes had built, like everyone else, a few poles and a layer of sod overhead. Good enough in dry weather, and gambling every time the sky opened up. Sometime that night, one of the load-bearing poles, already softened by years of weather and never replaced because replacing it meant money he didn't have, gave way. The roof came down. Not a leak this time. The whole structure folded in on the room where his children slept, burying beds and belongings under wet sod and broken wood. Nobody was killed, but everything the family owned that wasn't already ruined by the rain was ruined by the collapse. The last dry blanket, the good pot, whatever clothes hadn't already been mended past saving. Barnes wasn't unusual in that. Across Custer County alone, dozens of families lost a roof, a wall, or an entire dugout to a single bad storm in any given decade. And most of those collapses never got photographed, never got written down, never survived past the memory of the people standing in the wreckage. What actually sets Barnes apart is timing. A camera happened to find him before he'd had a single day to clean up, before he'd had any time at all to decide how the world should see him. The next morning, an itinerant photographer named Solomon Butcher arrived at the property. Butcher spent years riding across Custer County, photographing homestead families in front of their houses, building what's now the single largest surviving visual record of sod-house life in America. He didn't know about the collapse until he pulled up. Barnes could have turned him away. Instead, he gathered his 3 children, walked them out to what was left of the roofline, and stood for the photograph anyway. The picture survives. A man in a dark coat, jaw set, staring straight into the lens with no attempt at a smile. 3 children beside him, and behind all 4 of them, a sod house with its own roof caved in from the night before. Butcher titled it in his own catalogue, 3 Motherless Children and a Caved-in Soddy. It is one of the most reproduced images of the American frontier that exists. Printed in textbooks, hung in Nebraska history museums, held up as the single photograph that tells you what homesteading actually cost. Not the wagon trains, not the gunfights nobody in Custer County ever saw. A man standing in the wreckage of his own ceiling because he had nowhere else left to stand, and a photographer who happened to arrive at exactly the wrong moment. That's the part the Westerns leave out. The house wasn't a set piece, it was the whole risk, every single night, holding up or not holding up over the heads of people who had already spent everything to get there. A leaking roof wasn't scenery, it was the difference between a hard winter and a ruined one. A dirt floor wasn't rustic charm, it was the thing you scrubbed with dishwater at midnight so your children wouldn't breathe the dust. And the family organ in the corner of a house with no glass in the windows wasn't a contradiction, it was the whole point. People weren't just surviving out there, they were still trying to build a life worth having, in a house made of the ground itself, that could come down around them without warning. So the next time a film hands you a frontier house with varnished floors and a porch swing, remember what the real ones held up, or didn't. Most families who lived this way never had a camera pointed at them at all. What survives is a handful of photographs and houses like Barnes's, standing only because someone happened to be there the one morning it failed. Ask yourself what you'd have carried inside those 2-foot walls, and whether you'd have stood for the photograph anyway, jaw set, refusing to look away. There's more of this history behind the myth, and the next story picks up with the families who stayed on the plains long after the roofs stopped falling in.